Del Pruitt's cattle stood bawling at a fence line that hadn't held a blade of green grass in 6 weeks. Dust rising off pasture that stretched for miles in every direction, the same dead, sun-bleached color. And Mavis Jones could hear the sound of it clear across 2 properties from where she stood at the edge of her own standing sorghum. She wasn't gloating. She wanted that understood, even standing here now with feed enough to carry her own herd through a drought that was quietly starving out half the valley. She'd planted this crop 2 years earlier to a chorus of laughter that had followed her into church, into the feed store, into rooms where men who'd known her husband's family for 3 generations openly wondered aloud whether Roy Jones had married a woman who didn't understand the first thing about running cattle in grass country. If you've ever done something everyone around you swore was foolish, only to watch the ground itself prove them wrong, hit like right now, and tell me in the comments where you're watching this from tonight. Because what happens in this valley over the next few weeks is going to change how an entire county thinks about grass, forever. 2 years earlier, none of this had even started. Carrow Bend had run cattle on open-range grass for 3 generations by the time Mavis and Roy Jones took over the family operation, and in a valley like this, the belief ran deep and mostly unquestioned: real ranchers ran cattle on grass. Farmers grew crops. A man, or a woman, didn't do both, not if they wanted to be taken seriously by the men who mattered at the stockyard. Mavis had grown up 2 counties over on a mixed operation that ran both cattle and grain, and she'd never quite understood the rigid line Carrow Bend drew between the two. But she'd married into this valley, into this particular way of thinking, and for the first several years she mostly kept her opinions about it to herself. That started to change the spring. The rain simply stopped coming, and didn't start again. The county extension office mailed out a drought bulletin that spring, same as it had every dry year for as long as Mavis could remember, most of it standard advice about culling herds early and moving cattle to whatever grass could still be found. One section stopped her cold, though, a short passage about grain sorghum's deep root system and remarkably low water requirements compared to the native range grasses most of the valley depended on. Alongside a careful, detailed set of instructions about grazing timing and safe curing methods for cutting it as hay. She read that section 3 times standing at her own kitchen counter, then folded the bulletin into her shirt pocket and carried it out to the barn to find Roy. "I want to put in 40 acres of grain sorghum this spring," she told him. "Not to graze straight off. Cut for hay, cured proper, held back as insurance if this drought doesn't break." Roy didn't answer right away. He'd grown up in this valley same as everyone else, and he knew exactly what kind of conversation that idea was going to start the moment word got out. Roy's hesitation wasn't really about the crop itself. It was about what sorghum meant to Carrow Bend specifically, a fear that ran back nearly 2 decades to a story every rancher in the valley still told their children as a warning. Del Pruitt's father had lost the better part of his herd back in the 30s to poison Johnson grass regrowth after a hard frost, cattle collapsing in the field within the hour, dead before anyone understood what was happening to them. The story had calcified over the years into something simpler and more absolute than the actual tragedy had been. Not a lesson about grazing timing or frost-damaged regrowth. Just a flat, unquestioned rule. Sorghum killed cattle. Nobody in Carrow Bend planted it, not since, not ever. You put that crop in, Mavis, and half this valley's going to think you're either ignorant of what happened to the Pruitts or you don't care, Roy said. Del especially. That story's not just history to him. That was his own father's herd. Del Pruitt drove out to the Jones ranch himself once word of the planting reached him, parking at the fence line without bothering to come all the way up the drive. "I heard what you put in the ground out here," he said, not raising his voice, which somehow made it worse. "I'm not going to pretend I understand why a woman raised on a mixed operation thinks she knows better than this whole valley about a crop that killed my father's herd before you were even born. I'm not trying to disrespect what happened to your family, Del." I read the bulletin close. What killed those cattle was young frosted regrowth, grazed straight off without I don't need a pamphlet explaining my own family's tragedy back to me. Mavis. His voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone hard as stone. You plant that crop, that's your business. Just don't expect this valley to think kindly of it. He left without waiting for a response, and Mavis stood at her own fence line a long time afterward, understanding for the first time just how much weight this decision actually carried for people who'd lived through something she'd only ever read about in a bulletin. Word moved through Carrow Bend fast after that, the way it always did about anything touching the Pruitt family's old grief. At the feed store, at church, the talk took on a tone Mavis hadn't quite braced herself for, less mockery than genuine. Worried disapproval. Neighbors who'd known her for years now looking at her like she'd done something almost unkind. She planted the 40 acres anyway that spring, following the bulletin's guidance to the letter. Proper spacing, careful monitoring, a firm plan to cut it for hay and cure it fully rather than ever turning cattle loose on it green. Roy worked beside her without complaint, though Mavis knew exactly what it was costing him at the stockyard every time Del Pruitt's name came up in casual conversation now. If you've ever made a decision you knew would cost you standing with people whose good opinion actually mattered to you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Because Mavis was about to find out whether 40 acres of careful, unpopular planning could actually outlast an entire valley's fear. Subscribe now, because this story only gets more interesting from here. The rain that had stopped that spring simply never properly returned, and by the following year the whole valley understood they weren't looking at an ordinary dry season anymore. Creeks that had run steady for as long as anyone could remember slowed to a trickle and then stopped. Native range grass, already thin from years of steady grazing, began dying back faster than anyone had a plan for. Ranchers across Carrow Bend started making the same hard calculations Mavis had heard about from her own family 2 counties over. How many head could the remaining grass actually support? How early would herds need culling? How much longer could anyone afford to hold cattle they couldn't properly feed? Prices at the stockyard started sliding as more and more distressed sellers brought cattle to market at once, nobody wanting to be the last rancher holding animals on ground that couldn't feed them. Mavis's sorghum, cut and cured into hay the previous fall exactly as the bulletin had instructed, sat stacked in her barn. Real, tangible insurance against exactly the kind of year the valley was now living through. Mavis kept that folded bulletin in her shirt pocket through most of that second summer, its creases gone soft from handling, and she'd taken to reading the relevant section aloud to Roy some evenings, less because he needed reminding and more because saying it out loud helped her hold on to her own certainty. It's not that sorghum's dangerous and grass isn't, she told him one night. It's that sorghum's dangerous under specific conditions nobody around here ever bothered separating out from the crop itself. Young growth. Frost-damaged regrowth. Anything wilted and grazed green before it's had time to cure properly. Cut it right, cure it right, and the danger's mostly gone before it ever gets near a cow's mouth. Del's father didn't have a bulletin telling him that in the 30s. No. Mavis said. He didn't. That's not his fault, and it's not anybody's fault, really. It's just what happens when a real lesson gets simplified down over 20 years of grief into something a whole valley stops examining too closely. What Mavis had learned from that bulletin, and what she'd since confirmed through 2 full seasons of careful practice, is real, documented agricultural science that ranchers across the drought-stricken southern plains were relearning the hard way that same decade. Sorghum really can produce dangerous levels of prussic acid, a fast-acting cyanide compound, but only under specific triggering conditions: frost damage, drought stress, or young immature growth that gets grazed or chewed while still green and wilting. Cut that same crop for hay and let it cure fully, or ensile it properly, and the danger drops away almost entirely, because the process of drying or fermentation breaks down the compound long before it ever reaches an animal's mouth. It wasn't that Carrow Bend's fear of sorghum was foolish. It was that a real, specific, manageable danger had calcified over 2 decades of grief into a blanket rule nobody had the heart, or the reason, to look at closely again. This is exactly the kind of real science this channel loves digging into. Not just whether an old fear was right or wrong, but why it existed in the first place, and what actually got lost in the retelling. If that's the kind of story you want more of, subscribe now, because that's exactly what Root Chronicles does every single episode. By that second autumn, the drought had become the worst anyone in Carrow Bend could remember living through, worse even than the stories their own parents told about hard years decades back. Native pasture that had fed cattle across the whole county for generations was dying not in patches now but for miles at a stretch. Dust rising where grass used to stand, stock tanks shrinking to mud and then to nothing at all. Del Pruitt's operation, one of the largest and most respected in the valley, was taking the hardest hit of anyone's. He'd held onto his full herd longer than most, trusting in range management practices that had carried his family through hard years before, never once considering an alternative that carried the shadow of his father's old tragedy. By that October, he was facing the same brutal math as half the ranchers in Carrow Bend: sell now at collapsed prices, or watch cattle starve on ground that simply couldn't feed them anymore. Mavis and Roy's herd, meanwhile, was eating better that autumn than most of the cattle left in the county. Cured sorghum hay stretched carefully across a feeding schedule Mavis had planned out months in advance using the same careful attention she'd given the bulletin 2 years earlier. It wasn't easy. The hay wouldn't stretch forever, and Mavis rationed it with real anxiety about whether it would carry them through to whenever the drought finally broke. But it was something real and tangible in a year when most of the valley had nothing left to plan around at all. And that difference was becoming impossible for anyone in Carrow Bend to ignore, however quietly people were choosing to talk about it. The stockyard at the county seat ran its heaviest distress sale that October in living memory. Ranchers from across 3 counties bringing in cattle they could no longer afford to feed, prices collapsing further with every truckload that rolled through the gate. Mavis and Roy drove in that week too, not to sell, but because Roy had business at the feed store and Mavis wanted to see the scope of it with her own eyes. She stood at the rail a long while, watching men she'd known for years sign away herds their families had built up over decades, faces set in the particular blank exhaustion of people who'd run out of options they could live with. Del Pruitt was there that day too, further down the rail, watching his own reduced herd get sorted for auction with an expression Mavis had never once seen on him before. By that November, the drought had done what nobody in Carrow Bend had ever seen it do before: killed off native range grass not just on the hardest hit properties but across the entire valley, mile after mile of pasture gone the same uniform dust pale color, dead down to the root in places that had never failed even in the hard years their grandparents remembered. Ranchers who'd held onto their herds as long as they possibly could were finally forced into the same choice Del Pruitt had already made: sell what they could, cut losses, and hope the following year brought enough rain to start rebuilding from almost nothing. The valley's confidence in open-range grazing alone, unquestioned for 3 full generations, had finally met a drought severe enough to expose exactly how little margin that approach actually carried. Mavis's sorghum hay, meanwhile, was carrying her and Roy's herd through the worst of it, thinner than she'd like by that point in the season, but alive and fed, on ground that had never once needed a single blade of native grass to do it. Word of exactly how well the Jones herd was holding up traveled the same roads the old fear once had, and this time nobody at the feed store or the stockyard was inclined to laugh about it. Neighbors who'd quietly disapproved of Mavis's decision 2 years earlier started driving the long way around just to see her sorghum field for themselves. Still standing green against a backdrop of dead grass that stretched for miles in every direction. It wasn't an official report or a data presentation that convinced anyone. It was simply the sight of it, undeniable and impossible to argue with, the same way the dead grass itself was undeniable. If you've ever watched an entire community's certainty crack open the moment they finally saw proof standing right in front of them, I want to hear that story in the comments tonight. Because Mavis didn't win this argument with words. She won it by being right, quietly, for 2 whole years, until the drought made sure everyone in the valley could finally see it for themselves. Subscribe now, because Farm Route Chronicles is full of true stories exactly this stubborn. Del Pruitt drove out to the Jones Ranch himself that December. The first time he'd set foot on the property since that hard conversation at the fence line nearly 2 years earlier. He walked the edge of Mavis's sorghum field slowly, running a hand over the cured stubble left from the fall cutting, saying very little. "You cut it and cured it before you ever fed it," he finally said. Not quite a question. "Every time," Mavis said. The bulletin was specific about that. Dangers mostly in young growth, or frost damage, or anything grazed green and wilting. Cure it proper, and it's about as safe a feed as anything else in this valley. Del was quiet a long moment, looking out at the cured stubble like he was seeing something he'd spent 20 years actively refusing to look at closely. "My father's herd got into regrowth after a frost. Nobody around here ever explained it any more carefully than sorghum killed them. I don't think anybody wanted to look at it close enough to say more than that. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I was wrong to be afraid of it," Del said, still looking out at the field rather than at Mavis directly. "That fear cost my family something real. I don't imagine I'll ever plant the stuff myself, not after everything it took from my father. I wouldn't ask you to, Del. But I don't think I ever let myself wonder whether there was a version of that danger my father could have managed, if anybody back then had bothered to explain it the way your bulletin explained it to you." He shook his head slowly. "That's a hard thing to sit with, this late. 20 years of telling my own children a story that maybe didn't need to end the way it did, if anybody had understood it a little better at the time. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, and it wasn't forgiveness for a fear Mavis had never actually needed forgiven. It was something quieter and harder than either of those things. An old man finally letting himself grieve a tragedy as what it actually was, instead of the flattened, simplified version he'd been carrying for 20 years instead. Roy found Mavis at the fence line that evening after Del's truck pulled away, same as he'd found her there plenty of evenings over the past 2 hard years. "Didn't expect to see him out here," Roy said. "Neither did I." Mavis leaned against the fence post, watching the last light fade over cured, stubbled ground that had carried them through the hardest year either of them had ever lived through. "He's not going to plant it, Roy. I don't think he ever will. Didn't figure he would." Roy was quiet a moment. "Doesn't mean this whole thing didn't matter, though. Man drove out here to say something true about his own father, even if it cost him something to say it. That's not nothing, coming from Del Pruitt." Mavis didn't have much to add to that. She just stood with him a while longer, watching the same dust-colored horizon that had, for 2 long years, made her the most talked-about rancher in Carrow Bend for reasons that had finally, quietly, stopped being about mockery at all. By the following spring, with the drought still holding its grip on the county but the worst of that first brutal year finally behind them, a handful of ranchers who'd once quietly disapproved of Mavis's decision started stopping by her fence line with genuinely curious questions instead of worried disapproval. Mavis answered what she could, always pointing them back toward the same county extension bulletin that had started everything for her, always careful to walk through the specific management details, cutting timing, curing process, the difference between a manageable risk and a blanket fear, rather than simply telling neighbors the crop was safe and leaving it at that. She didn't oversell what had happened to her. She understood, better than most in the valley now, how easily a real and useful lesson could get flattened down into something simpler and less accurate if nobody bothered to keep explaining the actual details behind it. Mavis stood at the edge of her sorghum field the following autumn, watching Roy check the cutting equipment 2 rows down, cured hay from the previous season still stacked in the barn behind them as a reminder of exactly how close the whole county had come to losing everything the drought had tried to take. She still kept that original extension bulletin, worn soft from 2 years of handling, tucked now into a drawer alongside her own growing notes on planting dates and cutting schedules. The beginning of a record she suspected she'd be adding to for a long time to come. Not as a trophy. Just as a reminder of exactly how close a valley's fear had come to costing an entire generation of ranchers a real, manageable answer to the worst drought any of them had ever lived through. The valley didn't change everything overnight. Del Pruitt never did plant a single acre of sorghum himself, and Mavis had made her peace with that a long time before he ever drove out to tell her why. But nobody in Carrow Bend laughed at the sight of her green field standing against miles of dead grass anymore. Everything in this story is grounded in real agricultural history and real, documented science. The Texas drought of the 1950s was genuinely the worst on record for the region. Stretching from 1950 to 1957 and devastating pasture and rangeland across Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. Cattle prices collapsed as ranchers were forced into distress sales, and many turned to drought-tolerant crops like grain sorghum, which requires significantly less water than the range grasses and other crops the region had traditionally depended on. The danger in this story is real too. Sorghum and related forage species can produce prussic acid, a fast-acting cyanide compound, under specific conditions, frost damage. Drought stress, or immature growth grazed while still green and wilting. But that danger drops dramatically once the crop is properly cut for hay and fully cured, or ensiled and allowed to ferment, because both processes break the compound down before it ever reaches an animal. It's a genuine risk that requires real management, not a reason to avoid the crop altogether, a distinction that got lost for a lot of real ranchers throughout history, the same way it nearly did in this story. If stories built on real agricultural science and real history are what you come here for, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which detail in this story surprised you the most.